Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here today because I'm ready to talk a little bit about race. I have been sitting with the recent happenings and allowing myself to be worked by them. I have been trying to not reach out and speak out too much because I felt that it was important that I allow things to percolate inside of me before I come out and speak prematurely. My name is Deb Blum, and this is the Inside Out Activism show. So thanks for being here today. And so what happened is I really wanted to think about race from the context of inside out activism. So really exploring race from the inside out. And a couple of years ago, I started to unpack race in my life. Maybe it wasn't even quite a couple of years ago, but I was offered the invitation by a friend of mine who really opened my eyes to some of the things that I had not seen. It was the time when I watched the Seen on Radio Seeing White podcast series, and I read the book White Fragility and several other books. And it was the beginning of me understanding a little bit better about systemic racism, what my whiteness afforded me that I didn't understand before. I understood more about white privilege and white fragility and the idea of like white superiority, and it was a whole new thing for me to be exploring, as it is for many people right now who are exploring this. And so this isn't so much new for me, what's happening right now. But it is absolutely another layer, a much more deep, moving layer for me, as it is, I think, for many people. And I really think it's a wonderful thing that this is happening, as much as it's so hard for so many people, and so it's bringing up so many emotions, and it's really like the perfect storm, really, that's happening right now, because we have the shelter in place and sort of disrupted lives that we have across the world in many ways because of the pandemic. And then we had George Floyd's tragic, horrible death at the hands of a police officer. And then subsequently protesting, which just everyone was able to, it's almost like we all had the ability to spend more time, like we're more online, and we had the time to be able to actually pay attention in a way that we hadn't had masses of people paying attention in the past. And so it's like, on the one hand, it's painful for so many people, and I think it's like hard to acknowledge the reality of what's been happening for hundreds of years here and for millennia. It's hard to acknowledge that, but it's also really such a beautiful time to actually see people standing up and saying, like, no, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to stand beside our Black and brown brothers and sisters, and we're going to very, very blatantly acknowledge Black Lives Matter. And I haven't been speaking it because I don't want to be superficial, or I don't want to do anything performative in this space. I really want to come from a genuine place. And I wanted to come from the place of, what does Black Lives Matter to me? And how do I believe that white people can actually do genuine work to be in support of Black Lives Matter? And I don't mean it in the form of the organization. I mean, that's fine. If you want to donate to the organization, that's wonderful. But I'm talking more about the movement of, and I'm sure that there's maybe in some people's mind it's the same thing. But I just want to be clear that I'm really just talking about, how can people become a true, sustainable, long-term anti-racist? How can someone say, listen, here's the deal. we can't say all lives matter until we can first ensure that Black lives matter. I want to get to the point, I can't wait to get to the point where we can say all lives matter and it's an actual truth, right? I think that's what everybody wants. But right now, the priority is around Black lives. But for me, one of the challenges is that I see a lot of things happening at that performative level. I have seen it happening since my eyes were opened to whiteness and white superiority and racism. I have seen it over and over again where people will get activated by things, they will speak out, and they will be in the place of alarm and shock and really supportive, and then it sort of dies off again. And I think there's also the sense that perhaps it's enough just to speak. And so when people say it's time to speak out, I think that's true, and I think that's just not sufficient. And I think that for me, what I have really come to understand is that there are many pieces to addressing racism. And there are different people who are going to do different things. Some people will want to work with children. Some people are going to want to go out there, and maybe they're lawyers who actually can impact policy changes. There are going to be people who want to advocate for criminal justice reform. There are going to be people who are changing education systems. There are going to be people who march on the streets, some who protest. There are going to be people who are going to call their congressman, or they're going to run for office. There are all kinds of ways that we can do that. But the premise behind inside out activism is that in order for us to really make the change that will be sustainable in the long run, we really do need to make the changes within us first. Now, you can be taking action on the outside and then also doing the inner work. But if we don't do the inner work to find the parts of us that are unconsciously contributing to the environment, the society, the way that we live our lives, we will have a very hard time really dismantling the oppressive systems and structures that are in place. Because if we unconsciously have oppression energy within us, we will naturally create new systems. Even if we try to rebuild them, we're going to create new systems with oppression in them. And so what I mean by that is this. Inside of each one of us, we have a sense that each one of us as children, and then generations before, we have been in environments where we also have had our own form of oppression. And there are ways that we have been treated by our parents or by teachers or by other people, and we have this inner oppressor that gets cultivated. So what happens is we feel oppressed, we then maybe oppress other people, and maybe this is happening in little subtle ways. They're just little things that are happening, but they're ways that what we're doing is we're basically saying parts of ourselves aren't good enough, other people aren't good enough. I can have power over you. I can determine whether I think your life is valuable or not. There are ways that we treat ourselves and we treat other people. And those things create a culture where it's okay for people to oppress people. Now, if you go back generations past, what happens is that people in the past have been hurt in their own ways, have watched people get hurt. People have been slave owners, people have been slaves, people have been wrongly accused of maybe a crime, and people have been the one wrongly accusing. People hurt people, and people get hurt all the time. And so what happens is inside our blood, inside our being, inside our nervous system, we have trauma. And at the core of everything that we're talking about here, I truly believe is trauma. And what's happening is we have this core trauma within us. Now, do I understand all of the details of this? Actually, no, I don't. I am not professing to be a race expert. I am not professing whatsoever to understand all of these aspects. But what I do think that I have a deep understanding of is trauma. And even in that, I'm not even saying that I'm an expert in healing trauma, but I have had my own trauma. I have healed my own trauma. I have been in many classes about trauma and read a lot about trauma. And I feel like I at least have an understanding that trauma is at the core of so much of what it is that we're experiencing right now. And what happens is that as we get this trauma and we have pain inside of us, we may become more, if we don't look at it, if we don't examine it, if we don't pay attention to it, and I'm talking particularly people who are living in white bodies, we will become increasingly more fragile. And what that means is that it's just hard for us to hear anybody say anything that would defy our cherished view of ourselves, because we look at ourselves and we're like, but we're nice, we've done good, we've tried so hard to overcome all of those things that, we have hurt us, or places where we've hurt other people, and we've tried so hard. And then when someone says something like, hey, that's a pretty racist thing that you're saying right there, or when someone says, maybe you don't fully understand, or there's a way that someone says, maybe that's kind of rooted in white superiority, it's super hard to hear it. I remember when those things were pointed out to me at first, and I was like, when I thought of myself as like this kind person who always was generous and loving and caring, and I am. And I also am unappreciative of the ways that what I would say even to this day, because, I just want to acknowledge that it is a journey, but where I was hiding behind that in some ways. I wasn't willing to look and see how the systems and institutions play out in a way where people are not being treated fairly and equally. And that for me personally, I just didn't see how that related to me until I finally understood how it related to me, until I started to understand that there's an invisible thing happening, and it's invisible to me, and it's invisible to many other white people, but it's not invisible to Black people. It's not invisible to people of color, because there's a way that they're living it every day, and we're just walking around benefiting from things that we don't even understand are happening. And so it's become really clear to me that there are several things that have to be happening. But I do believe that this has to start from the inside out. And again, it doesn't mean that you're not walking a parallel path. Like, hey, listen, when I was learning to become a better parent, or when I was saving my marriage, I had to both be doing inner work, which was journaling and with a therapist and coaches and in courses and classes and learning. I had to do all of that stuff, but I simultaneously still had to show up and, be a parent, lead my family, be in a relationship with my husband. And so there are the practical things that we can be doing. There are things we can be doing to more vocally and actively show support and to really make change in this world, right? So that can be happening. But if we're not doing the inner work, the problem is it's happening on a more cognitive, strategic level. It's not happening in the deep embodied level of change. And I really believe that's what we're being called to do, is to do the change, to do change from the inside out. And it starts in several different ways. And one is, I do think that educating ourselves is really important. I think that that's what you'll get told by many, many people. And I think it's a really, really great first step for people, because if we don't really understand the real history of what's going on, it's like you can't really know what anyone's even talking about because we get taught misinformation all the time. And so I personally recommend listening to the podcast series Seeing White, which is on Seen on Radio. If you want to understand what the idea behind white fragility is, I think that checking out that book is a good one, just to understand, because there are certain things that, it's kind of hard. Like, I always hated when I would be in therapy and my therapist would point something out to me that seemed so obvious to her, that seemed so new to me. And I kind of felt this like icky sense that I was like the last one in on the reality of who I am. And I get that. I felt a lot of embarrassment when I saw some of the things that white people do that are kind of a consistent pattern. And I was like, oof, and it is hard. It's not an easy thing. And none of this work is easy. Every bit of this requires us to be taking a lot of responsibility for ourselves, for our ignorance, for our complicitness, for our ancestors' creation of this, for our lack of willingness to really see it, which, I don't blame people. In many ways, I don't blame people because I have learned that, you don't know what you know until you know. But also, when you know better, you need to do better. So it's the truth that you don't know. Like, there were times, listen, up until a couple of years ago, I was completely ignorant. I was like, no, I'm colorblind and I'm nice and I love everybody. And then until I realized it, then I was like, whoa, that just like, it just like in like kind of a couple of days time, my awareness was just like, and yeah. And so education is a really great place. And so educating yourself, and there are so many ways to educate yourself. Watch the movie 13th, the documentary on Netflix. There are so many ways. But what I think is also deep that needs to be explored is this. One of the things that happens is that if we haven't faced our own pain, if we haven't had our own pain held by other people, if we haven't healed and we haven't navigated it and looked at it and explored it, it's pretty darn hard to hold somebody else's pain. And so sometimes it's just important to start this journey by beginning to meet our own pain inside, by being willing to feel our own pain, to journal about our own pain, to talk to other people about our own pain, and to become comfortable with discomfort. To, whenever we have an opportunity where we are exposed to something new that does feel uncomfortable in our lives, rather than make the other person wrong and get defensive, which is natural. That's like really what fragility is, right? Fragility is that it's too painful to face the discomfort. We feel defensive. We feel like we're being attacked. And so then we show up and we kind of are a little fragile. Instead of meeting that discomfort and saying like, I wonder why I feel so uncomfortable right now. What are these feelings in my body? What do they mean? And what can I learn from them? And that's why we have to start by listening to ourselves. When we're in these situations and the invitation right now is to listen. When I first heard that, I remember thinking that meant listen, as in like, listen here now, you white person, you better listen to us and do what we say. And so the inner rebel in me kind of had this counter will reaction of like, no, like I can't do that. And it hit me that really it's different than that. What we're being called to do is listen with our hearts, to listen in our nervous systems, to be hearing another person's pain, and then also hearing the collective cry of pain. What we know is trauma is passed on generation after generation after generation, and some people say 14 generations. That means that you have trauma in your body. Black people have trauma in their bodies. All people have trauma in their bodies, and they are different types of trauma. But when trauma never, ever gets actually addressed, it just gets collectively built up more and more. And it is not to say that you don't have pain and you don't have trauma. Black Lives Matter is not saying that you don't have your own pain. It's saying that having a particular color skin has made it even more traumatic, has caused even more challenges, has made their lives even more difficult, and have made them have to face more discomfort. So it's not about ranking pain per se, but it is about having the ability to sit with another person and a collective's pain and say, I feel you. I hear you. I understand you to the best of my ability. I at least want to understand you. Even if I can't understand you, I want to understand you. And I care. And I'm sorry for any part I have played in hurting you. And that is what is being called for right now. So it's a listening. And yes, it's a listening to the words. And yes, it's a learning. But even more than that, it's a deep listening. It's a listening of the cries. It's a listening to the pain. It's a listening to the feelings and the needs and the experiences and the suffering and the trauma behind the words. It's a craving to know another person and to know the experience of another person. And the reason why it's so hard to do that is because so often what's happening is that inside of us we're saying, but what about my pain? Or we're trying to come at it from our minds and we're trying to say, but what about this? What about that statistic? What about that thing? And I noticed I was doing it too. I was noticing that I was getting a little caught up in some of that. Until I remembered that that's just not how humans, that's not how it works. The way that we heal and we move beyond is through connection, through nervous system healing, through deep listening, through care and love and compassion and seeing one another. It is through meeting people where they are. Like, I know that in my relationships that when my husband comes to me and shares something with me and he shares it unskillfully, and then I get into it with him and we kind of get into an argument, nothing really happens. But when I can drop my defenses and I can listen and I can put my feelings a little bit aside for a moment and say, I really just want to hear what he has to say, and I listen with my whole body, not just my ears and not just my mind, but I listen with my whole body, and I meet him with a genuine desire to understand what's happening and to hear him and to feel whatever pain it is that he's suffering. Well, then he can come through to the other side and feel that he really was heard. And it's then that we can talk about possible ways that we can move forward together. But when I come in defensively and I start telling him that, you can't say that, you're being too angry, I can't hear you when you're angry, and I start trying to tell him how he needs to communicate to me in order for me to be able to most hear him, we can't get anywhere. And the trick, though, is to not believe that we can jump to the place of being authentic listeners in that way in a moment's notice. So we have to do the best we can, right? We can be listeners at the level of listener that we are right now. We can do the best to put our defenses down and to listen. But I have learned that it takes time to get to the place where we can really meet people where they are and where we can listen with our whole bodies, where we can bring compassion, and where we can have a genuine, deep, deep desire to understand the other person. Because I think if we come at it with like a superficiality, we will just continue to do the same things that we're doing right now. But if we come at it with depth and with as regulated of a nervous system as we can, and with care and love and compassion and the ability to be able to put our defenses and needs even aside to listen. And I'm not talking about being a martyr. It's really important that I say this. Like, I want people to try not to take the approach of like, okay, I will just be quiet while you listen, but while you speak, and I'll just be a listener. And it's this way that it's kind of like a submissive thing. I don't think anybody wants that. I think people just want us white people to own our shit. They just want us to do our own work and to stop with our ignorance and get our heads out of the sand and to realize what they've been knowing for all this time and that we haven't looked at. And they're just saying, please, just do your work, learn it, clean up your own stuff, own your own defensiveness. Stop showing up in the world in a way where whiteness is the barometer for like what's like normal, and start being open and curious to the richness of our uniqueness, and also genuinely tapping into the beauty of our oneness, right? It's like it's all of it. But we can't transcend this with just this, like, I don't really believe that we can yet transcend what's happening with like a unity consciousness message, even though I absolutely believe that that is where we can get to. But I have learned that the human body, the nervous system, the heart, the emotions, there is a way that we heal through connection and through being heard and being felt and experienced, and by hearing ourselves and feeling our own experiences and being with us and learning how to be with discomfort and difficult emotions and learning how to hold in other people those difficult emotions. Those are the kinds of things that are the pathway out for us. And that is why I believe it's an inside-out journey. I've been doing this work for about 10, maybe 11 years, this inner journey, this journey of being able to see the unconscious stuff inside of me and to become more aware of it, to bring the unconscious into my conscious awareness, to heal traumas from my past, to be able to look at the shadows, the dark parts of myself, and to be able to be honest with myself and to acknowledge that those parts do exist, and to not live in a denied sense that I'm some, nice, kind person and that's enough. To really embrace all of humanity, the good, bad, and the ugly. And this work is beautiful, amazing work. And it is kind of a little bit of a myth that we're happy when we just kind of sit in this kind of constricted place of just wanting life to be this way. Like, the more that I embrace the like all of humanity, all parts of humanity, the more rich my life becomes, I actually appreciate the messiness and the volatility of it all in a way that I couldn't have before when I was living in this narrow view of what my life should be. And I still have a lot of work to do, a lot of work left to do. I want to just share with you an example of something that happened one time with me. I was in an event. I was co-leading an event, and there were men and women in this group, but it was actually an event that was for men. It was an event that was in support of our boys and trying to understand more about what's going on with our boys. And there were men there who did work with boys. And what we were talking about was how important it is that we can be able to express ourselves in the ways that we need to express ourselves, even when it's kind of uncomfortable for other people. And it reminds me of how people have judgments about the ways that people in protests are expressing themselves, and or even not even just in protests, but just in communicating, and how there's this way of like, well, can't you just, not be so angry? Can't you just speak to me? Can't you have respect for me? And then there's a phrase called tone policing. And so it's like that kind of thing, right? So sometimes people have to express things in their own way. And in this time, I know it's not exactly accurate because you might say that men aren't oppressed. But I think in this setting, what we were talking about was that there are ways that all of us are oppressed. Okay, so this happened to have been a group specific for boys and men. So it was their chance to be able to speak in the way that was right for them. Well, there was another man that was leading, and he was saying something that was very upsetting and very dismissive and very difficult for another man to hear. And the man who was speaking wouldn't stop talking. He was just persistent in what he was doing. And that other man was feeling very upset about what was happening. But it was very hard for anyone to interject. And so this man that was in the audience clapped his hands really loud and said something very loud. Well, there were women in the room, and those women in the room got very upset by it. And they wanted him to not have raised his voice and clapped his hands. It startled them. They were talking about how they have trauma and that this was a lot for them to handle. And you can hear my dog barking. So I said, so I listened, and I even had a reaction to it too. So it's not that I wasn't there. It's not that I was just sitting there with no reaction at all. But then it hit me, and I said, oh my gosh, but we're here in support of men. We're trying to listen to men's voices in this group. And so I calmly stated that. I said, wait, but what if we are expecting people to share their pain in skillful, perfect ways when they're not ready, when they need a space to be able to express that in a way that we can hold? So my invitation is, and by the way, that's what people ended up talking about that yes, that's true. And we ended up really making some great progress, and a lot of the women in the group were saying that it was really helpful for them because they realized that often their sons and their husbands and their brothers and their fathers have tried to talk to them in ways that they have felt that was too forceful or too loud or too even like angry. And they immediately felt that sense of being hurt and offended and disrespected. And they were no longer willing to hear the men in their lives for that reason. And I feel like even though it's not an exact example, it just is an example of something that I saw happen where things shifted. And I feel like that's an invitation here as well. is to say that, of course, we should not be in situations where anyone's abusing us or being violent towards us, but we can be in a situation where perhaps we can allow people more room to express themselves in their way that they want to express themselves, and see if we can check ourselves and see, are we taking this personally? Is this personal? Like maybe this is personal for them, and what they're dealing with, we can hold for them. And so I'll leave it with this final note. Not everyone is going to be able to hear other people in the same way. Sometimes we just literally cannot. And there are times when people talk about certain issues and it might activate me and I might feel defensive and I cannot be a listener in that moment. But I do believe if we can, we should. So if we are capable of being a listener, if we are capable of healing and holding other people's pains, if we're capable of hearing people, I really do believe that at the end of the day, we will have made a big impact, and that we will have allowed other people to metabolize emotions and pain and suffering that they weren't able to before. And I say this about everyone. Now, in particular, if you have the opportunity to do this with people of color, either personally or in groups, or even just by listening to them and really feeling them in your body, you will be metabolizing your own experience. That is beautiful. But I also think more people need to be supporting white people who are struggling with being a listener. We need more people to become listeners of all people. And so if we can become listeners and we can start holding for other people space for them to be able to deal with their pain and process their pain, I truly believe we're ultimately going to rise together. I really, really believe that. And I believe that what's happening, I believe that a lot of times you'll hear people say things like hurt people hurt people. But at one point in my life, I had a wise man tell me that he didn't really think that that was really true. And we walked through a process to get to the place where I understood that it was actually much more about people who feel unheard are more likely to hurt people. Because when you feel like when you're going through pain with people, when you have your own pain and you're experiencing something that's painful, when you do it with other people, when you feel like you're not alone and when you feel like you're heard and you're attended to and cared for, and then you can actually metabolize those emotions, we find that people don't tend to have the level of trauma from them. But it's when we have to go through things alone, or when no one's ever listening, or nothing ever gets better, and we're literally feeling powerless over our lives, what ends up happening is that we end up in a lot more pain and a lot more suffering. We end up disconnecting from ourselves, getting into like hypervigilance and into a mode of just trying to survive. And what we know is that when we're in that mode, when we have the trauma coursing through our bodies and we are in that hypervigilant state in the survival brain, we aren't as effective. We are not as good of students. We cannot learn as much. We cannot connect the way that we want to. We cannot be as productive in the world as we want to. We end up finding things like we find ourselves succumbing to mechanisms to be able to suppress the feelings that we are feeling, to maybe to numb out, to we get addicted to all kinds of things, not just drugs and alcohol, all kinds of things, and food and shopping and consumerism and money and all kinds of things we get addicted to try to fill the hole in our soul. And ultimately, we need to fill our own hole in our soul, okay? And when we fill the hole in our soul, then we will rise. But if we can't fill the hole in our soul, and then we can't look out there and be the love and the support and the space for other people to fill their holes in their souls, it'll be hard for us to really make any sustainable change. And so let's do this together. Let's do this. If you feel like this interests you at all, one of the things you could start doing, you could join my Facebook group. You can check it out down below in the show notes. It's called Inside Out Activists. And that is a place where we're talking about things like this. We're talking about inside out work. and it's specifically right now we're talking about race, and I hope that we keep race on our radar screen until it is absolutely not something we need to be talking about anymore. However, I do believe that any inner work we do, any healing work we do, will be in support of eradicating oppression in all ways. And any ways that you show up as a parent to not bring in an oppressive environment in your home, that too will be a contributing factor to making a difference in the world. And so that is one thing you could do. You can subscribe to this channel because I will be talking about more of this. And then, of course, please educate yourself. Please be a listener. Please speak out and ask questions of other people. Ask other white people who maybe are on their path to on their path of consciousness, their path of healing, on their own path of understanding their whiteness and their white superiority and their white privilege, and also being able to unpack racism and systemic racism and what has been happening in our country, and even to some degree, around the world. Right now, I'm particularly focused on what's happening in the United States of America. So yeah, there are a lot of ways that you can get started, but I really believe that when we try to do things from the place of our brains, we can get a lot done, but we will come up against some limiting factors because we will be trying to change something that we have unconscious forces that are holding us back from really making the impact that we could make. And I've also come to see that when I make the change from the inside out, that it's not what I do in the world that matters as much, it's who I be in the world. It's who I be. And who we are in the world, how we show up in the world, if you can do the work to really heal inside and to really understand the racist within us, each one of us, the oppressor within each one of us, I think we would be unstoppable. I really believe we could create an amazing world that we can't even conceive of right now, because we're trying to conceive of a new world we want to create based on the paradigm that we live in right now. But imagine if inside of each one of us we deconstruct that paradigm and we start to live our lives with this sense that anything that comes to us that activates us inside, we're willing to look at that. Any place where we show up and we're less than who we want to be, we're willing to explore why we're doing that and show up differently. Anytime that we feel defensive or our feelings are hurt, we get to look inside and we get to see what's going on inside of us. And then we bring more and more of our whole selves to this amazing world and universe. I really think we can make this change, and we can walk together side by side with people of all skin colors, all races and religions and sexual preferences and genders, and any person, because every time we feel an abrasion, we then look inside and we say, And anytime we believe that we are so sure, that we are so right, that we know that person and we other them and we other them and we other them, because we are so righteous that we turn in and we say, what's going on inside of me? So that's my big invitation, is to get on the journey, the inside out journey. If you do go into our group, I do have a unit in there, which is me adding in some of the people, the speakers, and the amazing minds of people who I believe are guiding us on an inside-out journey around race. These are people of color who are incredible thinkers, talking about nervous systems and egos and how we can be healing and walking forward And so if you join the Facebook group, you will get access to that. And as well as if you subscribe, you'll get access to more of my videos. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you understand that this is the exact opposite of any kind of bypass. This is not about bypassing that there are important social justice things to be doing in the world, but it is about saying that there is inner justice that needs to be done as well. I typically would say that I think that if you were in a position to choose only one, that the inner work may not be as obvious immediately. It may not be, it might not allow you to claim your, your badge of honor that you're doing the work. But ultimately, the inner work will manifest in a much more powerful way over time. And I think it's easy to get swept away by a sense of urgency, and I get that there's a sense of urgency. And if we try to do a quick fix and we just do a couple of things right now, make a poster and go protest, and then we feel kind of like we've done our part, we're going to wake up again next year in the same place. So if we start doing the inner work right now, by next year, you will have made massive progress. So thank you to all of you. It has been so great I appreciate you taking the time to listen today. This is long, 46 minutes. I apologize for it being so long, but I think it needed to be this long because I think it was really important for you to hear a white woman speaking about race from maybe a different perspective. I'm not sure. And I wanted to say one more time for anyone who didn't catch this before, I am not a race expert, but I am a person who I've done a lot of my own inner work. I believe that the space where I am most capable of supporting people is in becoming a leader of our own lives, stepping into true empowerment, really, really understanding and trying to dive deep into our shadows, looking at the places where we hold ourselves back from being our most fully expressed self, the places where we try to control other people to get our needs met instead of really standing in our own power, the ways that we don't do the things that we really want to do or things that we think are important because we feel like we don't know how to get started. And most of all, in this case, the places where we have our heads in the sand and we don't really want to look and we'd really rather just go back to the way things were, but we can't. And we need someone to guide us to a place where we are willing to really do the deep exploration work and to be the allies that we really want to be. Not performative allies, not allies that are here today and gone tomorrow, but people who live and breathe it, maybe not through the outside actions that some people are, but live and breathe it because we don't want to live in a world like this anymore. And we don't want to be part of something that causes any person, but particularly a large group of people, to feel that in any way they do not belong or that they're not worthy of being treated with like the deepest love, care, respect, and appreciation. And so if that's what we believe, if we truly believe that that's what we want in this world, well, let's go for it together.